Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer, and I am delighted to be here with Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is the executive director of TRUA, a human rights organization of rabbis. Welcome to The Long View.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here with you.
Maybe we can just start. Not everyone is familiar with the work TRUA does, but you can talk a little bit about the organization.
Absolutely. TRUA is an organization of more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors across the United States and Canada. So we have members serving communities in 47 states as well as 6 provinces of Canada. And our rabbis are working in synagogues and schools and campuses and really everywhere else that rabbis work. And we work on human rights both here at home in the US and Canada and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So sometimes it looks like working on legislation or policy, protests, educating our own communities, doing work to bring a Jewish moral voice to crucial human rights issues in both of the places where we have deep commitments, in the US and Canada, where our rabbis live, and in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories.
And I know you've been very active in Minneapolis in response to everything that's happened, including the deaths of 2 American citizens and others. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what your organization has been doing and what other allies have you been working with when you were there on the ground?
Yeah, so first of all, we have a number of rabbis in the Twin Cities and the surrounding area, and our Minneapolis St. Paul rabbis have been out there really for weeks protesting ICE, doing ICE Watch, accompanying immigrants to court, and also taking care of communities. We know of synagogues, for example, that have adopted public schools and made sure that and dropped off food for families in that particular school who are afraid to leave their home. So our rabbis are and their communities who live in Minneapolis and St. Paul are very much involved in the movement there and have been for weeks. We've seen Jewish community members and rabbis put out very strong statements from Minneapolis over the last few weeks. And then last week, there was a request for faith leaders to come to Minneapolis on Thursday and Friday. And our Minneapolis St. Paul rabbis asked for their own colleagues to fly out there. So we brought several dozen, about 50 rabbis coming from outside of the Minneapolis St. Paul area to Minnesota, and they participated in the protests that many people might have seen at the news, at the airport, at Target. It was supposed to be outside, but because it was 20 below zero, it ended up being inside of a stadium. And we're there as a faith presence to say that there is a moral voice in this country of not only rabbis, but ministers, priests, imams, other faith leaders, and people of faith saying that we very much believe that every single human being is created in the image of God, that what ICE is doing, murdering people and kidnapping people off our streets, is a violation of our clear moral values as well as of our values as Americans. And it's important that there's a faith voice that gets through to say this isn't just about politics. This isn't about if you're a Democrat or Republican or wherever you stand politically. This is actually a clear values issue, because we're just not going to sit down and watch as our neighbors get kidnapped.
Do you feel when I've written about the 60s, it's always struck me how religious leaders, when they got involved in civil rights, were able to reach broader audiences sometimes than civil rights activists themselves because of everything you're saying. Did you feel that's still true? I mean, in our hardened political times, does that moral voice still have the ability to reach apolitical or less interested audiences?
I think the moral voice might be the thing that can reach a broader audience because I think people sometimes shut themselves off when it's about partisan politics or arguing about immigration reform as kind of a theoretical issue. But um, moral leaders are able to just break through that and to speak with a really clear voice. It's significant that, of course, Dr. King took as his core narrative the story of the Exodus from Egypt and was able to bring that out in a very powerful way that spoke to at least Jews and Christians who share that narrative. And I don't think it was lost on anybody that in the Jewish community that we are right in the middle of reading that story in synagogue right now. We're right in the middle of the book of Exodus and are reading about first the experience of a small minority that is living comfortably as a small foreign minority until a new leader decides to scapegoat them and oppress them. And then the efforts of that minority to try to push back against this powerful autocrat. So that story is very live. And I don't think there's a single, certainly not a single rabbi or a single Jew who's on the street who doesn't see the parallels between that story of Pharaoh and the Israelites and the story of what's happening now in Minneapolis and other cities.
And when you were there on the ground, what did you see? I mean, many of us are reading about it or seeing video of it, but what was it like to be there? What was the atmosphere? I
Yeah,
assume you saw ice too.
so I personally wasn't able to be there last week,
Okay.
but we had, thankfully, Tra has many rabbis, and so one of our board members was there along with many of our other rabbis. So I've heard reports from them, and what they've said to a person is that um, first that they've never seen anything like it. That many just ordinary people and faith leaders coming together. The that ICE is everywhere in Minneapolis. Just the number of ICE agents is so overwhelming compared to other places like Chicago or LA, which are much bigger cities where ICE has come in at a much smaller level. That really ICE is everywhere. That there is that the protesters are absolutely not violent, despite some of the lies that are being spread by the administration, that all of the violence is coming from the side of ICE, and that even the Minneapolis Police Department and the Minnesota National Guard are they are pushing back against the overreaches and the violence of ICE. And of course, we heard so much about how powerful it was to have a religious community come together. And we also heard that from our Minnesota rabbis who felt very supported by having their colleagues show up.
And how is the interfaith dimension of this? This has always been very important in political mobilizations, again, back in the 60s. Is that working smoothly? Is there friction, or do you find there's a good convergence of different faiths around the issue?
Yeah, there are absolutely faith leaders from all traditions who are coming together around this issue and sometimes putting aside other things that one might disagree on because we all can agree on protecting our neighbors. I'll say that on Sunday night, I was on a prayer call, a national prayer call organized by Faith in Action, which is an interfaith organization. And it was announced, I think, either Saturday night or Sunday morning, and 12,000 people registered for the call. The Zoom capacity was 5,000 people, so everybody else had to watch it on Facebook Live. But 12,000 people around the country who wanted to be on an interfaith prayer call that had Jewish and Muslim and Christian leaders, Christians of different denominations, praying together. And so that's some indication of first, how deep the need is to have a religious voice and how much people want to be there in the presence of religious voices, and also that people from those different faith traditions could come together around this issue.
And do you find that heartening? I mean, we've just lived through several years since October 7th when there were divisions and fissures around Israelis and Palestinians and the issues surrounding that war. And some thought there could never be this kind of alliance again. But it sounds like that's just not true, and that this is working pretty well and in a formidable way in response to what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of divisions, obviously, over the last couple of years, and often a demand from people who both are more on the right and more on the left of a certain purity of politics, that I can't work with you on anything unless we agree on Israel Palestine. And we've seen that. I won't say that it's not present, but I will say that in this case, it has really dropped away because there's a realization that the most important thing right now is protecting our neighbors. And we can argue about other global issues another time, but we have to be able to put aside those those concerns, not put them aside. Of course, the lives of Israelis and Palestinians remain crucially important, and certainly Tra is not has not stopped our work in that regard, but that we have to be able to work together when we can work together. It's important, there's a principle of coalition that says no permanent allies, no permanent enemies. And I very much believe in that. That just as the right is so good at bringing together Wall Street billionaires with evangelicals, with farmers, with all sorts of different people who maybe would not go out and get a drink together and might not agree with each other on 90% of things, but they can agree on a few things. And they've successfully gotten together, for example, to elect a president the president they wanted, or to put in other policies that they can agree on. And sometimes those of us on the left or the liberal side feel like we can't work together unless we agree on everything. And that is not how we get things done. The way we get things done is to work together on what we can.
How do you feel we've reached this point morally? Meaning, Rabbi Heschel, who's Abraham Heschel, is a kind of predecessor in many ways of the work you do, would write about how we ended up in World War II. How did we get
Yeah.
to the moral point that that could happen? How do you feel we have reached this point where not just the specific events of the last few weeks, but just the general atmosphere toward immigrants and the use of federal power this way? How did we get here from a religious point of view?
Yeah, one thing I think a lot about is the um, just the unraveling of the social fabric in the United States. If there was a social fabric, I'm not sure, but the United States very famously is a very individualistic place, right? Famously from one of the Obama elections, the line, "You didn't build that," right? And the pushback against that, the sense of if I did anything, if I started a small business, if I got a college degree, whatever I did it all by myself without being aware of all of the social structures that make that possible for everybody or that make it impossible for other people. Um, and so just that kind of go it alone, we saw this very much during COVID in particular, where there was some sense of, well, I'm not going to care about the elderly people who are more susceptible to COVID, or I'm just going to try to take care of my own family, or I don't want to mask, in the early days when there was really, when there's a deep need for masking and a push against it, right? There was a sense of like, I'm just going to take care of myself, however I define that, and not take care of other people. And I think that is really deep in the American psyche. And it's this kind of American individualistic, go it alone. And so that's a piece of it. And we've also had years and years of politicians who have been telling us that immigrants are the problem. If you're not succeeding in your business, if you lost your job, if you can't afford to pay your rent, um, instead of looking at all of the other reasons that might be the case, including the huge, just the huge gap between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans, the fact that minimum wage hasn't kept up with inflation, right? All the reasons that people might be economically suffering, it's much easier to say, actually, none of that, right? Don't look over here. Look at these people, let's scapegoat these people, which is something that we've seen throughout history, right? To go back to the story we're in the middle of right now. I mean, Pharaoh saying, let's scapegoat these Israelites, right? If anything happens in Egypt, if there's a war, we don't trust them that they're not going to fight against us. And so that's just been classic. And it's the role of religious leaders to push back and to say, we are just not going to accept that language, that whether you're an immigrant, whether you're born here, you're created in the image of God exactly the same. And we're just not even going to entertain that.
Can I ask, one thing I've admired about watching and reading you over the years is your activism flows from your Judaism. You're not simply a rabbi who's politically active, but it's intricately connected to your understanding of theology, of tradition. For those who are not as familiar kind of with this sort of connection, can you talk a little bit about how that works for you and how that informs your thinking?
Yeah, so I want to start by skipping ahead a few weeks in the Torah reading to the point where the Jews are actually out of Egypt and they're standing at Mount Sinai and they're getting the Torah. And it is significant that this is one of the first things that happens after the people are liberated from Egypt. That God doesn't wait until they get into the land of Israel or to some future moment, but gives them this law code right away. And that is significant because basically what God is saying is, look, now you are a free people. You're not subjugated to Pharaoh. There's not some outside power that is telling you what to do. You now have free choice, and you have the responsibility to create a just community. And you need a law code to do that. You need an agreement about how one creates a just community. And really significantly, some of the very first laws that are given are are interpersonal laws, like how are like paying your worker. What happens if two people get into a fight? Like just the laws of just day-to-day life. Not I mean, yes, there's also laws about worshiping God and kind of big grand holidays and, big grand ideas, but really those laws about how do you actually create a just society. And for me, that is what Torah is all about. It's Torah is asking the question of how do we create a society that is the most just for the most people? And all of Jewish law afterwards spins forth from those initial from that initial giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And so we have books and books of law codes that are dealing not only with what you can eat and what you can't eat, but also um, what's the relationship between landlords and tenants, and how are you supposed to deal with immigrants, foreigners in your land, and workers, and how should workers and employers deal with each other? This is really essential to what it means to be Jewish. There's something that happens often that when rabbis get up and they talk about something that's considered political, and I want to be really careful about this because, it's Judaism doesn't teach, the Torah doesn't teach about partisan politics. It doesn't say be a Democrat or a Republican or, any other party that's ever existed, but it has a lot to say about politics, meaning how people are supposed to live together in society. And so often rabbis, if they speak about immigration, for example, or any other issue, they're told, don't be political, right? Why don't you talk about Judaism, not politics, Rabbi? But you just open up the Torah and it's full of guidance for how we're supposed to build a just society. That is, you can't extract that and pretend that you have Judaism left.
Before I get to my final questions, let me thank all the subscribers who are watching now, who watch when I post it, and also thank you to paid subscribers for keeping the long view going. I appreciate your support. It allows me to bring important voices like this, and thank you. Um, so now back to Minneapolis, or back to the broader, it's not simply Minneapolis. Could you just talk a little about what comes next? What not only your organization but this coalition are planning so that people can know, and how do you envision this kind of really monumental historic struggle that we are in the
Yeah.
middle of, that you are in the middle of?
Yeah, this is certainly not over. We see that there's some movement in ICE in Minneapolis, but certainly this is not over. So there's been protests across the country for the last at least more than a week and continuing. So people should look out for those locally. TRA and our partners at Bend the Arc are organizing a Jewish community protest in DC on February 11th outside of ICE headquarters. There are also, like I said, there's many protests in many cities between now and then that folks should look out for locally. And we're also monitoring what's happening in other cities. We've been in touch this week with our colleagues, with our rabbinic members in Maine, which is a new target for ICE. We know many of them have already been on the street, as well as in cities like LA, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, other places. And so we are very much watching to see where ICE goes next because we know that it won't end with Minneapolis. And thankfully, like I said, we have rabbis in 47 states. So for the most part, we'll be able to organize people wherever ICE decides to show up, and work with our interfaith partners. I mentioned that we've been working with Faith in Action, and that will, including on some upcoming actions that will be happening. And so people should just really look for what's happening in your local community, follow people on whatever social media you're on who will be posting about that, get in touch with local community groups, because it is really important that there's a clear voice that's coming not only from Minneapolis, but from every single corner of the country saying that we're not going to tolerate ICE coming in and murdering people or stealing our neighbors away.
Martin Luther King Jr. said that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but the key is people have to move it that way. It doesn't happen automatically. And your work and your organization's work has been so important. I urge people to take a look. Rabbi Jill Jacobs and Trua, and all of that is online, including, I'm sure, you can find the different mobilizations that are taking place. So thank you, Rabbi Jacobs, for joining the Long View.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye bye.
Bye.